So if you have an injury, you need to realize that healing takes time. There are different stages of healing I'm going to talk about now. There's acute, subacute, remodeling, functional, and return to sport. And these are all on the timeline. So here's the acute phase of healing. This is where you have active bruising. You can see the bruising with the macro trauma. You've got swelling that comes in. Your body's trying to bridge the gap if you've torn some tissue. And this is the period of time right after an injury. So we know that muscle healing peaks at 2 weeks. And that would be just after the acute phase of healing. The acute phase of healing is up to 1 week. And you can see on the timeline where it starts at 0 weeks and it goes up to 60 weeks almost. The acute phase of healing is that yellow part. And it's a very small part of the timeline. But this is probably the most crucial part of the timeline after an injury. This is when you really need to control the swelling, reduce re-injury, compress the swelling, and start to reintroduce some passive motion as soon as you can. So next is the subacute phase of healing. This is when you start to rebuild. You can see the arrow right there. We're into the orange zone. And the subacute phase of healing is when you want to start moving inflammation away from the injured area. Effleurage, massage, that stuff away from the injured area. And the subacute phase is 3 to 4 weeks. Again, this is a really crucial period of time for the healing process during an injury. So if you had a whiplash injury, this is the part of time where you really want to see the symptoms go down. Otherwise, you have a greater chance of having chronic symptoms. But in this phase of healing, you're starting to lay down some of the stem cells that create collagen fiber to rebuild. And once those stem cells are laid down and the collagen fibers are starting to be formed by fibroblasts microscopically, now you're in the remodeling phase of healing. And this is when you want to strengthen those connections. You've bridged the gaps with collagen fibers. They're contracting and they're bridging those two together, and they're starting to form junctions again between the one side of the injury and the other side. But now you want to strengthen the connections. And what that looks like is this. You've got to take the fibers and you've got to stretch them out with a tensile force. You don't want to compress them. You want to go with a tensile force. So if you contract a muscle, the contractile elements in the ligament in the muscle or the tendon in the muscle has to be under a load to stimulate the healing process. So we want good movement and we want strong movement. So stretching and movement help to align the microscopic collagen fibers. But this remodeling phase can take up to 52 weeks, like up to a year, depending on what part of the body it is. If it's a ligament, there's very poor blood supply, and so it can take longer. If it's muscle, well, we learned that muscle healing peaks at 2 weeks. So the remodeling phase for muscle is way earlier in the timeline. So how long should a treatment plan be? What do you think? At the top here, we've got the acute and the subacute phase, and that's the most crucial point, and that's 6 weeks. But at the bottom, we've got 60 weeks as you go through the remodeling and the functional phase and return to sport. So if you're deciding on the chiropractic treatment plan, you're going to want your treatment plan to be a little bit more frequently in the first few weeks. And then you taper off from there. Because usually in the chiropractic office, you're receiving passive care where stuff is done to you. We want to move you past passive care and more towards active care, where you are being more active and you are taking the initiative to actively contract your muscles. So 6 weeks is the most important stretch of time. Most frequently come in for care. During the remodeling phase, you're starting to segue into the functional phase and the return to sport if you're an athlete. Now, functional phase is a very important part of the remodeling phase because during the functional phase, you're still rebuilding strength but you're also working on speed, agility, flexibility, and what we call proprioception. Proprioception is your awareness in space. So I've got my finger right here. I can see my finger. I can see it with the way it moves. I can feel it, and I can watch it move. But if I put my finger behind my back, I can no longer see my finger and see what it's up to, but I know exactly where my finger is in space because the muscles and joint receptors for my finger are very active, telling my brain where things are in space. So proprioception is something that can be disrupted after an injury, along with agility and flexibility. So you want to rebuild that by doing some balance exercises, as well as some of the strengthening exercises that you know you should do. Now, return to sport is when you are at full strength again, but you still have to work on maintaining full strength, maintaining your agility and your range of motion and your proprioception and your balance. So these are very important parts of the remodeling phase, and this is something that you should be actively doing yourself, and maybe with a strength and conditioning coach if you're an athlete, but this is something that's active care that you should be doing for yourself. And that concludes soft tissue healing. And it should hopefully give you a better idea of why a chiropractic care plan or even a physical therapist's care plan is structured the way it's structured.